A majority of gamers that play RPGs are familiar with the concept of a tank. No, not that kind of tank. Do you think this is funny? Next image. Please! Yes, there we go. These guys right here. Look at this big, beastly, bulging man. These boisterous, unwavering walls are responsible for keeping entire groups alive through their own swagger. Through sheer presence, intimidation, a little bit of streamlining, and some good armor, a tank's role is to protect his allies and direct as much damage as possible towards themselves. It's a selfless role, but somebody has to do it. A mage in cloth armor or a hunter with a bow stands no chance against 5 enemies. You need to send in the tanks. Though tanks are conceived and used differently in each game, a majority of them share a large health pool, active mitigation abilities to reduce damage taken, and crowd control abilities to ensure they can keep check of the maximum number of targets. Over the 16 years that World of Warcraft has been out, developers have shifted the methods of tanking and changed priorities in regards to how groups tackle an encounter. This video is going to discuss my love for tanking and what initially drew me into it, but as well criticize the past and present versions of tanking in the hopes to figure out which one is better. But let me first state that I was and never will be a hardcore player. I'm very much attracted to the casual side of WoW. I've never been interested in going in massive raids to do things on a prolonged period of time with 10 to 40 people, because that never really spoke to me. I never wanted to commit that much time, let alone even have that much time. Now, this in no way delegitimizes any of the points that I'm going to make, as most of these still do apply to people that are even doing raiding, with the exception of 1 or 2 different stat points. Also, given that my favorite thing to do while playing World of Warcraft is level, I'm going to be focusing on my experiences while leveling, because that's the thing that speaks to me the most, and I really want to determine which iteration of WoW, Classic or Retail, nailed it down the best. Ever since I started playing WoW, I had been obsessed with the concept of a tank. And although I only started near the tail end of vanilla, I was still able to get a character to 60. I was not a tank though, I was a rogue. And although my damage was good, I was always envious of these tanks that I was in groups with. These guys directed the group in every facet, what strategy would be implemented on a difficult boss, who or what should be taken out or CC'd before a fight started. These guys were the leaders of the groups. And because I liked being the leader of a group, I thought I could emulate them. So I rolled out my paladin in the hopes of leading my group into battle. What was it like? It was awful, and I clearly haven't learned my lesson because here I am doing the same fucking thing. Leveling as a tank back then was slow. Until it wasn't, but we're not there yet, alright? Remember that because you were a tank, you were expected to be the leader of a group, which means that almost everybody in your party expected you to know every single engagement that there was for every different dungeon. People knew going in as a tank required something more than just stabbing things in the back while some guys shouted at the enemy to get their attention. And because of this, there weren't that many tanks, and there were even fewer good ones. Couple that with the atrocious leveling, and you have a role that's in high demand and short supply. This only makes the role more cherished and revered amongst the lowly mages. So what made tanking so difficult then? If all I had to do was yell and stand in front of somebody, that concept shouldn't be too hard, right? Well, it helps to start from the beginning. Going from classic archetypes set up in Dungeons & Dragons, tanks had a higher armor class, meaning they could wear durable and heavy armor to protect them from massive blows and a variety of abilities that made the enemy turn to them. Included with this was a sort of blocking mechanism, which I used with my group back in college whenever possible. If you could stand in front of an area and block the enemies from passing through you, you could effectively have the rest of your group deal damage from behind you as you act as an impassable barrier of metal and flesh. But World of Warcraft didn't have that type of collision. They needed something else to stand in its place. That thing is called threat. Threat is generated from all of your abilities, and the amount of threat you generate correlates with who has the attention of any given target. In vanilla WoW, threat mattered a lot, and if your offensive damage dealers, the DPSers, went ham on an enemy before you as a tank could set up why you should be the target of the enemy, then they would break their vows with you and pursue another lover. Healers also generated threat through their heals, so you didn't want your healer to heal you before you set up any threat because they might take aggro and you'll have a problem. Even buffs to a target generated threat. Tanks had a way to deal with this with abilities that generated more threat, so again, where's the problem? If you have a threat generating ability, why can't you do it? Because tanks didn't do as much damage in Classic WoW, and with the exception of a few cases, and in a few you'll soon see, tanks still don't do that much damage. Because how broken would it be to not take as much damage and still deal as much as another class? Right? Right? Off. And if your gear wasn't as good as your allies' gear, their threat would be even higher since they were dealing substantially more damage than you. Coupled with RNG completely screwing you over, you could have a hard time keeping aggro on anything with the entire group going up in flames as you race to each enemy politely asking them to hurt you instead. To give you an understanding, let's say you have 3 enemies. You need to generate threat on all of them to ensure that at least one hit won't break aggro with them so your healer can continue to heal without taking aggro. So you want to hit them all with your sword at least once or use an area of an effect spell to deal damage to all of them. Still, you and your group should focus down one at a time. But let's say that your Huntard over here doesn't like to follow the rules and focus his fire on a different enemy as your group continues to wail on the focus target. Well, now you have to keep swapping targets to ensure that you can hold aggro on both. If you lose aggro, the enemy will walk past you to hit him. But let's take it further. Let's say that when you first started attacking, the enemy dodged one of your attacks. Well, now you've generated no threat, and you can be sure that dipshit McGee over here has already attempted to sink 20 arrows into him. And now you've lost aggro. So you have to be quick on your feet and adapt to a given situation. In another example, let's say I open off with a crit. I've now dealt more damage and consequently generated more threat. Because of that, I can focus more on another enemy, making the damage dealers more confident to press forward with more damage. The groups I've been with in Classic WoW, for the most part, are cognizant of the threat they generate as they realize if they take aggro, they could get hurt or die. With the exception of a few individuals and people still learning how threat even works, I've rarely had the case where someone charges in ahead of me like it's 2 minutes to dinner time with mom breathing down the back of their neck. You can't pause online games, mom! This might also be a good time to talk about just how strong enemy NPCs were and how weak players were. This is a side-by-side comparison of me doing content between Classic WoW and Retail WoW. Notice the differences. You see, on the left side you have pain, agony, and slow gameplay, but at the same time unhurried and relaxing. On the right, we have high APM madness and button-mashing glory, but also vapid gameplay. I know this is just me alone and not in a dungeon, but just look at the differences. Something of WoW has clearly changed here, and I'm not sure how much I like it. Back to the classic dungeon, each pool is methodical and thought out. There's a reason to take things slower, as the potential for dying is far higher. If an enemy runs away and no one kills him before he talks to his friend, the likelihood of a wipe increases. By that, if a patrol comes close and someone walks in their path, you've just added more to your plate and resources can be massively impactful.
Why are you running?
This means that planning and preparation plays a larger role for everyone in the group. CCing through a rogue sap, a mage polymorph, druid root, etc. are not only useful, they are sometimes required. Juxtapose that with retail WoW and even the healer pulls if you aren't fast enough. You're going to take more damage. There's a sense of urgency in Retail WoW's dungeons. I found that I stopped appreciating the minor details in a dungeon ever since around the Mists of Pandaria, because I was moving along like a tour bus driver that's 5 minutes from ending his shift. Now I know I'm coming off as extremely critical of Retail WoW, but there's actually a lot to say wow about. That's it. That's a joke. Earlier when I was talking about hypothetical situations, I used the word adapt to describe how a tank plays in Classic WoW. You adapt to a given situation based on what happens around you. The unpredictability of RNG, in lower levels at least, is what makes the experience fun to me. Blizzard realized that banking your entire group's well-being on a good or a bad tank meant a bad time for a majority of casual players, as a tank who couldn't hold threat would prevent the players from playing their classes. So starting in Wrath of the Lich King and on to Cataclysm, threat was basically removed from the equation. It almost felt impossible to take aggro from the tank, regardless of how much you outdamaged them. But why? If that was one of the core fundamentals, what would take its place? Short cooldown and active mitigation abilities, new and unique boss fights, and removed AoE hit cap. The developers knew that if they couldn't make the threat an interactive part of a tank's job, then boss mechanics would have to take its place. Bosses usually carried heavy-hitting abilities that couldn't be soaked up by the average player, and starting in MOP, tanks carried damage mitigation abilities to help them with these burst phases of fights, and regular abilities to be soaked. Add spawning, standing in a blast to reduce the damage to everyone else. A whole world of opportunities opened up for developers. In raids, bosses became tauntable, leading to regular tank swap fights with stacking healing debuffs, damage taken debuffs, armor debuffs, and so on. Fights no longer revolved around adaptability, and instead more around reactivity. Interrupting spells, knowing when to press your mitigation button, that's what a tank's job is now. The question becomes then, which is more fun? Being more adaptive to a situation, or reactive to an encounter? I don't mean to say that Classic WoW had no reactive moments, or that Retail doesn't have moments where you need to adapt, but both clearly have their sides. Personally, I like having to juggle threat and CC enemies to make an encounter easier. Even if the fights itself aren't filled with button spamming nonsense, players understand what is at stake in every pull, and wipes cost a lot more than they do in Retail. I still like the engaging mechanics of bosses in Retail WoW, but not to the same degree I would enjoy formulating every pull around a group composition. The boss mechanics don't change the second time I run through a dungeon, but my group composition does, and that matters a lot. I adapt to my group's strengths and weaknesses. If I have a more cleave-oriented team, I'll prefer to use my AoE spells and not worry about generating more single-target threat to please the rogues or warriors. If my team has more single-target damage, I'll mark a target, ask for a CC on something that would be difficult to hold, and then go from there. I've never found myself doing this in retail WoW. I hardly ever wait for my healer's mana, and everything outside of boss fights are boring. I feel more stressed in retail WoW's dungeons because of the uniqueness of all the bosses. A single up leads to a vote kick. It's hard to keep up with the mechanics of every dungeon, and people are hypercritical in retail. Even after a wipe in Classic, I always worry that I'll have a rage quit over a loss, but that still hasn't happened. I feel more connected with my group in Classic too. Not only because we had to form the group, but options for chatting during a pull are more common. Trying to chat and tank at retail WoW would not be possible because there's always something beneficial to press. So at the end of the day, after much explanation and build-up, I do enjoy the concept of tanking more in Classic WoW than in Retail WoW. Retail WoW's experience is more vapid, but mildly amusing for what it is. I'm aware that more difficult platforms such as Mythic Dungeons and Raids are a thing, but I've never been a fan of ramping up the difficulty in such a way. Looking at you, Borderlands, to make a more interesting experience, although I did definitely enjoy it in Legion. The problem then becomes the fact that, as it is endgame content, people have massive requirements you must meet as a player in their world, and I'm still more casual than most. I can't be held down by one game. In Classic WoW, we have a shaman tank and we're good to go. This relaxed and casual atmosphere is far more appealing to me as a player, and it's the reason I'll continue to choose it over retail. Thank you so much for watching. If you play WoW, let me know in the comments what your preferences are. I enjoy reading the opinions of others and want to hear what you have to say about this.